Greetings, we are back, Kinesiology 236, Chapter 9, the knee joint, and this is session number 2. All right, so I know some of these you'll know, most of them you should know from our previous conversations regarding the hip joint, but you know the quadricep group has 4 muscles, quad, like quadruped, 4 muscles in the group, rectus femoris is the 2-joint muscle, and then he has his vastus buddies who show up, who are single joint, which is vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis. For the quadricep group, but more importantly, just the actual Q angle itself, the book goes into description and describes the line between the anterior superior iliac spine denoted up here and the patella, and then you have the actual line of the tibia itself. And when you look at this angle that's represented here by these 2 kind of fuchsia colored lines is the Q angle, quadricep angle. And I noted earlier when we talked about it in terms of quadricep angle, if the pelvis itself is wider and it pushes this angle out, meaning the superior iliac spine, or if, for example, just anatomically the person is just built in a manner where they actually internally rotate more, you'll notice a greater Q angle. So when you look at athletes and you kind of evaluate your athletes or your clients, this is a key component. But this is a key component in a static environment, like looking at a picture like we are right now, but it's also a key component in a more dynamic environment. So when you look at this and you kind of look back at those deep 6 that I reflected on a little bit earlier, they become important in keeping the femur from internally rotating and putting the body in a bigger or greater Q angle, specifically valgus, where the knee buckles in. And if you look at this from an exercise standpoint, more dynamic, it looks like this, right? So here's this super awesome athlete down here doing a jump with a counter movement, and pay attention to the knees, right? Both knees stay pretty symmetrical on jump and landing, jump and landing. I'll replay that for you so you can see the athleticism of this guy. Poof. No real buckle in the knee, no real buckle in the knee. Oftentimes, what you'll see though in your athletes, especially female athletes, is this. The knee buckles in, the hip follows. Knee buckles in, hip follows, and see the torso twist as well. And then the landing with the knee buckling in. Oftentimes, you'll see this symmetrical. And you'll see this on both sides. It'll be bilateral, right? Instead of being asymmetrical, where both knees buckle in. Now, I urge you to have your athletes or your clients do basic movements, or maybe perhaps you're doing just a freestanding squat and you track the knee. You can do this type of counter movement jump and pay attention to valgus, both on the jump phase, but also on the landing phase, which is heavy eccentric loading. So pay attention to both. And just kind of think through now what's happening to, place again, MCL, what's happening to medial collateral ligament as a person is collapsing the knee in valgus, what is happening in terms of the external rotators, the deep 6 up here, and allowing that to happen. Boom. More importantly, just imagine this in a dynamic cutting environment where a person cuts on the right leg and they're pushing off and that knee buckles in. They're really putting a ton of stress on their ACL as well. And this is the culprit for ACL injuries. That valgus position, weak development up in the glutes, and stressors that are heavy on the medial side of the knee. Be aware of those when you look at your athletes and look at your clients. And okay, both of them jump in. There we go. So you can compare them side by side. Sorry about I was trying to get them both to go. Look at that athlete. Holy smokes. Now, one thing I just wanted to point out too is when you look at hamstring and quadricep, they're antagonistic muscle groups. And think back to chapter 2, back on page 53, we talked about muscle spindles and GTO. And you look at this and you go, okay, one of them, when you look at the muscle spindles, you know, they're used to measure when there's a rapid stretch. They have a stretch reflex and then they fire the muscle that's being overstretched and cause it to contract. Now, GTO, when you look at those in the tendons, they fire, not so much, but they send the impulse up to the central nervous system, and they don't fire per se, but the impulse that comes back down is they cause the muscle to relax, and then they fire the antagonistic muscle group. So now just think dynamically through this, right? When somebody is doing a very dynamic sprint movement that perhaps they didn't train for, they did a lot of static toe touching for stretching their hamstrings, but they didn't do any dynamic flexibility work. Then you get into an early season training program and they're doing sprint work. What's happening, they've not trained the GTO to understand the range of motion that they're going to work through. They've not trained their GTOs basically to shut off or even quiet a little bit, not so much shut off, but to kind of quiet down and not cause this overactive stretch response. So you'll oftentimes see athletes who come in deconditioned, where they've not trained through a proper range of motion for sprint activity, and they activate these GTO receptors, and these proprioceptors fire the central nervous system and cause a stretch, and more accurately, a contractile response, and they cause hamstring tears, they cause other tears or cramping or inadvertent contractions in the musculature that inhibits the ability to be athletic. So part of training properly is, like we saw with the jumping, training people to be able to jump and land correctly, being able to use the muscles to stabilize, but also you have to work these proprioceptors to be able to get them to function correctly, but also understand that they're going to be placed under greater load. So this is a systematic approach to win these guys over and get the muscle spindles and GTO to understand what a stretch reflex is and just how far they can move without causing the stretch reflex. It's an important part of training that many times is overlooked in sprint training. I just wanted to point that out, especially when we're talking about antagonistic muscle groups like the quadriceps and the hamstrings. Okay. Q angle, etc. Higher Q angles dispose people to injuries. We know that from before. We talked about how there's a predisposition to this, but also there's a higher preponderance of it when you talk about female athletes in high school versus male athletes. And this is actually a pretty darn good article right here from the NSC that you can link out to, read a little bit more about ACL injury and prevention thereof. And they cite some of these bullet points. With the hamstrings, this we know in terms of what semimembranosus, tendinosis, and biceps femoris does in terms of activity. And then you have this little guy, this popliteal muscle or popliteus muscle that also assists in hamstring rotation. Now what's interesting is when you look at the two joint muscles, well, you know all the hamstring muscles do this. So these three here, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris, long and short head, they are two joint muscles, and they articulate both at the hip as well as the knee. And so when I was using the example earlier and I showed that person who was doing knee flexion, and I pointed out it was kind of obscured by the way the video was shot, the hip and the pelvis articulated a little bit as a compensation pattern to the knee flexion movement. Part of it is the length of a lever that's being moved. There's weight there, and that mass is causing the pelvis to articulate to help stabilize, but also part of it is the hamstrings are a two-joint muscle. So doing knee flexion is going to cause the pelvis to articulate. Conversely, when you look at, you have the three vastus brothers, right? And then you also have rectus femoris. When rectus femoris is called into play, that's a two-joint muscle, and that's going to cause the pelvis to articulate a little bit. And the book makes a pretty good example, and I'm just going to kind of let you guys read through this while I talk. The book does a pretty good example explaining this relationship, but I think it's just important to note, and you can kind of see that in that video, and it's good for you to kind of realize that just when you start to get your hands on people. Now the book does point out this goosefoot. I jokingly call it, I'll go right to goosefoot, and that's what it's referred to as, because you have these tendons that come down to actually make what looks like a goosefoot across the knee joint. I've linked in a Wikipedia article right here. You can click it right from HTTPS. Go right through that handle and then click out to it. I have to do a cut and paste, but I think you'll get that. You won't be quizzed on this, but I thought it was an interesting read. And then when you get into the rest of the muscles, when we look at rectus femoris and the vastus brothers, I thought this slide was a little bit confusing because the first part of it, they start talking about the gastroc and like, well, the gastroc itself is on the posterior side of the body and the quadriceps are on the anterior side. So I thought that was kind of confusing. I didn't want you guys to get too wrapped up in it and get confused on that. But you know, rectus femoris, two joint, you know, vastus intermedius, lateralis, and medialis, the vastus brothers, or vastus cousins, whatever you want to say, are all single joint. All right, and they all cross the knee through the sesamoid bone, that is the patella, and attached down here on the tibial tuberosity. Good, good, good. Got it. With the hamstrings, now we know this is a posterior view because the leg is on the right side of the picture, not the left side. So if it's the back side of the right leg here, main muscles, we know those. And when you look at the quadriceps as well as the hamstrings, the quadriceps through extending the knee joint in conjunction with extending the hip joint with the other hip extensors are used in jumping activities, but also conversely, they're used in decelerating through eccentric loading in knee flexion and hip flexion. Got it? I'll leave this up here so you can read through it, and you already know this about being a two-joint muscle. Now, one point that I thought was kind of interesting with the book, that this could be somewhat misleading, right? So you'd like to have the hamstrings quadricep ratio where the quadriceps are in general 25 to 33% stronger than the hamstring group. Okay, this is great, but this can be kind of misleading, right? Because the book doesn't differentiate that, and we talked about this with simple machines earlier in the class. One hamstring piece of equipment will have a different pulley configuration and the weight might feel different. Additionally, a person who is in a seated leg curl position versus a prone leg curl position will be in a different hip flexion position. And you know from what we just talked about with the hamstring group, those are two joint muscles. So by being in a seated position where the hips are at 90 degrees versus being in a prone position where the hips are more extended, perhaps at about 150 degrees, that's going to change how the hamstrings are positioned. It's going to change the efficacy of their ability to move more weight. So realize this is nice, but the book doesn't fully clarify how it can be different based on different pieces of equipment or different positions. They don't specify how it can be measured. Moving on. So the other part of this is when you look at the quadricep versus the hamstrings, the book goes into quadricep exercises that are very much single joint. And when you look at some of these activities that they're describing, whether it's step-ups or squats or leg extension, it's a single joint or multi-joint exercise, and that should resonate given the quadricep. You have single joint and two joint muscles, and in the hamstrings you have single joint and two joint muscles. Just kind of realize that, kind of start to process this and be critical of what you're reading. All right, so I'm gonna blast through these so you have them. You know, rectus femoris is two joint, extension of the knees, etc. I want to put these up here so you have them. So when you get into what muscle am I, you'll be able to pick these out a little bit better. Extension of the knee, got it. So notice where it originates from. Where it originates from, single joint, crosses the knee. This is the hamstrings, are on the right-hand side of the slide. Semitendinosus, biceps femoris, and semimembranosus. Yep. And I just want to point this out to you in case you want to look this up. Semitendinosus, semimembranosus, there's a difference there, and I urge you to look at why that is in terms of the tendon insertion or type of tendon. Okay, so with hamstrings, I talked about this in terms of the running mechanics and being able to work and shut off that or quiet that GTO or muscle spindle response. Hamstring muscles, okay, this you know, this you know, this you know. This is stuff you'll be quizzed on, like about 30 seconds left. And popliteus, or popliteal as I like to jokingly say, this is the one sole knee flexor, only knee flexor. Color codify these for your benefit. Color codify these. Color codify these, because I'm a heck of a guy. Same thing with these. And that is it. I got 10 seconds. And with that, guys, have a good